Sure, why don't we start here right at the front?
Title of your book is Kissinger the Idealist, and you said that he identified appeasement with realism. And I'm just curious about this. By the time Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, he obviously knew enough history to know that Hitler had shredded the Treaty of Versailles by occupying the Rhineland, and of course by occupying Austria. Yet he believed that Hitler would keep his word when he promised that he was going to stop with the Sudetenlands in Czechoslovakia. So I just wondered why he identified that position with realism.
If one reads the literature on the foreign policy of Chamberlain's government, it's very clear that Chamberlain did not have a naive trust in Hitler and understood very well that he was playing for time, and that the strongest arguments that were made inside the government against acting in 1938 was that Britain wasn't ready for war. It wasn't ready in terms of armament, and it wasn't ready financially, economically. There were also a lot of imperial extra-European factors at work, but I don't think one can accuse Chamberlain of naivety, except insofar as he bought the foreign policy line that a strategy of cunction, wonderful word, playing for time, would be advantageous to Britain. And they made the mistake that's commonly made in strategic decision-making to assume that other things will somehow hold equal, while you exercise the advantage of additional time. In reality, and Churchill understood this well, time was advantageous to Hitler, who was by no means ready for war in 1938. In fact, if Chamberlain had been listening to the intel he was getting from Berlin, he would have acted in 1938, because war in 1938 would have been a terrific gamble for Hitler. He was strongly warned against it by his own generals, and with the Czech army in play, it would have been a very, very difficult and very different war from the one that happened in September 1939. So in that sense, I think we can see this as a classic example of realism going wrong. The decision-making was essentially realist in that Chamberlain and his close advisors thought that the Czechs were really just expendable. I mean, they essentially threw Czechoslovakia under the bus, and they did it for what they thought was hard-headed realist reasons. If we can only have another year, we'll be better prepared to beat the Germans. And it went horribly wrong. Kissinger puts it this way: they gambled that Hitler was a traditional German nationalist, and they found out they were wrong, and 50 million people died as a result.
Sure.
Here's an opportunity for you to give a one-word answer. Do you agree with the thesis of Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that he published 4 or 5 years ago, that violence has declined in recent history and we are living in the least violent period in our historical lives, all our history?
Yes.
There we go, all right.
May I add a rider, or
Sure.
is that all you want?
Go right ahead.
I disagree with the inference that will continue for the indefinite future. I think there's nothing in the book to refute the probability that there will be and could be a dramatic escalation of violence in the near future. The problem about Steve's book, and he's a good friend and I admire his work very much, is that statistically it infers that there's something that we can rely on about this trend for it to continue. And unfortunately, I don't think the data support that, because you could have argued in 1913 that the world was getting steadily less and less violent, and somebody actually did. He was called Norman Angell, and the book was called The Great Illusion, and the world wars proved that theory completely wrong. The world wars look like complete outliers on any trend chart that you draw for violence, whether you're talking about war or other forms of smaller scale violence. The idea that there could never be another such outlier can't be right, because we now have nuclear weapons. And in that sense, you could create an even bigger outlier with just a series of small bad decisions by countries with nuclear arms. So much as I admire Steve's book and broadly support the historical story he's telling, particularly about things like homicide, which, I mean, we see even in the United States a significant decline in gun violence relative to, say, 1968. People often forget that. I buy that, but I don't buy the idea that we're good, we're fine, and we're just going to go on getting better and better until we're perfect angels.
Neil, a short question. Being 66 years old, I'd like to ask you, how much longer till Volume 2 comes out?
Well, I'm glad to recognise Jim Dixon, a dear friend who is acknowledged in the book as somebody who patiently read the manuscript and identified errors. There are a few more eagle-eyed readers in the world than Jim. Jim, I wish I could say it'll be in your inbox Monday. I think realistically I probably need another year of research to finish the research for Volume 2. And then the writing could be 2, maybe 3 years to get it done. For reasons that must be obvious to everybody in the room, the really difficult terrain lies ahead because it's the terrain of the Nixon and Ford administrations, and because
And the swinging.
And the swinging. The swinging is less well documented than the government, but the problem is that we have just a mountain of material about those administrations, including telephone transcripts. We probably have more documentation of those administrations than of any other administrations in the history of the United States, and certainly better documentation than of recent administrations. It's all there on paper. And it's going to take a long time for me to work my way through such an enormous amount of material, plus the material from the foreign archives, some of which I've got and some of which is still to come. I mean, getting the Chinese documents, for example, which will be crucial to our understanding of 1971-72, it's happening, but slowly. And I don't really want to go to press until I've got that, because I think the real challenge for Volume 2 is to tell this story, some of which is familiar to us, the story of Nixon in particular, but to tell it from multiple vantage points so that we understand how the world looked from the other side, from Moscow, from Beijing, also from London, from Jerusalem, from as many of the different capitals that really the United States dealt with, and that's a lot. I mean, just Chile, which is one of the most controversial subjects of all, is taking a lot of time because really not that many scholars have done serious work on the Chilean archives. Stick around.
As a a serious sort of historian, how would you have broken through the Bush cabal of Cheney and Rumsfeld to make your case, and what kind of advice would you have given the Obama administration about what would be appropriate for Syria?
Great questions. I gave a paper at Yale on Monday on decision making in 2 crises, comparing the aftermath of 9/11 with the aftermath of what I call 9/15, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which happened the same month, 7 years later, to the same administration. But because it was a financial crisis, it was dealt with completely differently. And one of the striking things about the way, for example, the Federal Reserve handled the financial crisis was just how big a role history played. Ben Bernanke, by sheer good luck, had studied as an academic the Great Depression. And we were very fortunate that he was in the position of chairman of the Fed when disaster struck. Quite quickly, if one looks at the FOMC transcripts, the discussion moves from economic models, which turn out to be completely wrong, to history. And the decision making is strongly influenced by a quite systematic discussion of the precedents. By contrast, as far as I can see, and I'm still working on this, there's much less systematic discussion of the historical precedents that might be appropriate in the wake of 9/11. Bush in particular tends to take the line, this is completely new. We're in totally new territory. This is a new era. And that's a way of kind of ousting history from the decision-making process. So I think one of the simple answers to your first question is that you needed to have a historian in the room making the case that it wasn't that different. It wasn't a completely unique contingency, and that there were relevant analogies to be drawn. I should just add a rider. We don't have the same level of documentation of the post-9/11 discussions because the documents haven't been released, whereas the FOMC transcripts are all out. And I think until we see, for example, how my colleague at the Hoover Institution, Condoleezza Rice, handled those key meetings, what exactly was said at those meetings, until we have that documentation, we can't really pass a final judgment. On Syria, I think it was perfectly obvious, because not only I, but many people were making the argument after the outbreak of the Arab Spring that the risk existed of a rapid escalation of civil war in Syria unless the United States acted. And one of the most interesting things about the history of the Obama administration is how it was the president who resisted pressure from his most senior military and civilian advisors to take action. The president took the decision not to act on the famous red line over chemical weapons pretty much on his own, as far as I can establish, or certainly not after any discussion with what I would regard as the appropriate advisors. And so one of the interesting things that future historians will be grappling with is why it was that President Obama shrank the circle of advisors and essentially excluded properly qualified people from the key decision. I was very horrified in January, I think 2014, to read an interview by David Remnick of the president, in which he said about foreign policy, I don't really need a George Kennan right now. And those of us who regard Kennan as one of the great architects of Cold War strategy, and certainly one of the great readers of Soviet or Russian strategy, had to take a step back in amazement that the president could so casually dismiss real expertise on a foreign policy issue. And just a few weeks later, Putin annexed Crimea, proving that having George Kennan in the room might just have been quite helpful to the president. So, there's a systematic exclusion of historical expertise from the highest level of decision making. And it doesn't begin in the year 2000. I think it's something that Kissinger complained about with respect to the Johnson administration. He talks about this in 1968, saying there's a terrible history deficit in Washington. And you read the Johnson Tuesday lunches minutes, it's absolutely true. I mean, there's just no attempt to think historically about what they're doing in Vietnam.
Going back to the Vietnam War, I think in 1964, 65, most people, the vast majority of people in the United States, viewed that war as an extension of the Cold War, the confrontation between the Soviets and the United States, possibly China. But by the late 60s, the early 70s, there was a very different view that people were coming to, and that is that what we're dealing with here is really a civil war in which the United States has pitted itself with special interest, in a sense, in South Vietnam, whereas Ho Chi Minh was a person of national stature in Vietnam. And how do you view this now, as having gone through this period in your book? Question, was this a part of the Cold War, primarily confrontation there, or was in fact the view of those who view this as a civil war? Should that be viewed as a dominant theme?
Well, the research shows that it was both. And that was what made it so toxic, that you had simultaneously a kind of nationalist decolonization imperative and substantial outside funding and armaments coming to Hanoi from the Soviets and the Chinese, and a real competition actually between Moscow and Beijing for influence over Hanoi. I think one reason that Americans found it so difficult to figure Vietnam out was that they wanted to think of it as a dichotomy, the way that you posed the question, when in fact these things are not mutually exclusive. And I think if one looks at opinion in even 1968, it's really striking how much we've forgotten the mood of that time. If you look at polling from 1968, there was still very strong support for the war. This is one reason that the option of just kind of throwing in the towel wasn't open to Johnson and Humphrey. Not only that, but fascinatingly, young people were in favor of escalating the war. This is not at all what you would expect if you just had a kind of, let's call it the TV version of Vietnam. Actually, only a tiny minority of young people in the United States were at college, and only a minority of them were hippies who were occupying the administration buildings. Most young people were not, in fact, at college, and they favored escalation because they thought that escalation was the way to end the war. So when, in that sense, the Nixon administration adopted a policy of Vietnamization on the ground but escalation in the air, it was responding to what the public thought would fix the problem. The only group in 1968 that was solidly against the war were African Americans. So I think we have to kind of really start treating Vietnam as history and stop regarding it as part of living politics, because those people, I think of Bernie Sanders, who recently inveighed against Henry Kissinger in one of his debates against Hillary Clinton. Those people who want to treat the 1968 period or the early 1970s as if it's sort of live politics are suffering from very bad amnesia, because their memories are not actually consistent with what was happening at the time. And I'm trying to capture that in the book. I have the advantage, and I think it is an advantage, of not being American. That means that I can approach the Vietnam War with some of the detachment of a citizen of a country that stayed out. And it's very interesting that Britain stayed completely out, and that opposition to intervention in Vietnam crossed the political spectrum. It was obviously there in the Labour Party, but Enoch Powell, who was one of the great conservative firebrands of the 1960s, was just as against intervention in Vietnam. So I hope that's one of the things that makes this book a bit different from the other books, many of which still seem to be influenced by the mood of campuses in the late 60s and early 70s, I guess because the authors were amongst that minority of people occupying University Hall.
I think we have to stop it right there. Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you very much indeed.